Hello again. So before we start, let's set our motivation and consider all beings. Especially it's good to start with those we know, but to extend to all beings and consider how everybody wants happiness. And we want happiness, and we want to do our best to find lasting happiness and fulfillment. And one way that we can do that is through eliminating suffering, and then that makes us happy. So with that in mind, how do we eliminate suffering completely? Well, we can do that by changing our minds. And by changing our minds, we can become enlightened. And enlightenment means to be free from suffering. So that's what we can work on. And then it's no good just us thinking about ourselves. We've got to think about everybody. So why not do that in a way which can benefit everybody? And the way to do that is by becoming a Buddha, full Buddha. So a Bodhisattva is somebody who chooses to shoulder the burden of responsibility for all beings by becoming a Buddha. So that sounds like a plan. So let's do that. And then with that in mind, follow the 6 perfections, of which the 5th is developing and sustaining serenity, or this deep level of concentration. So that's what we're talking today. So let's listen carefully and consider how we can learn from and bring into our daily practice aspects of today's sharing or talk on attaining serenity. So this is chapter 5. Last week last session and the session before, we covered laxity and excitement, and before that we covered mindfulness and vigilance. So mindfulness and vigilance are the tools that we use to develop our focus, to develop our serenity. And then the obstacles the primary obstacles that we need to deal with are laxity, relaxing too much in the mind in terms of our focus, and excitement is either applying too hard or just jumping around. So in this sense, what we're going to want to look at now is the path that leads to serenity itself. So in chapter 5, Rinpoche covers various different points, and I think we'll again split this into 2 sessions. So the first is really, he just wants to say that, well, what are the stages? How we've talked in general about the various different aspects of developing serenity. So what are the stages? What should we be looking for, and how do they work in terms of achieving or arriving at a state of serenity in our minds through this practice of developing serenity in concentration meditation? So in general, the normal traditional way of looking at that is to say there are nine states of meditation, mental states, from the beginning to achievement. So the first of these is known as mental placement, and this is where we are working on actually engaging in the practice, where we're cutting down our distractions, doing our best to focus on a single object of meditation, and we're directing it inwardly. So what directing it inwardly means we're not looking for a sense, we're looking for a mental object, including the mind. Sometimes this is the clarity of the mind or the knowing aspect of the mind specifically, but also it can be a visualized object. But the important thing is it belongs within the scope of the mind, not of the body or externally. So at this point, initially, our job is just to try to develop some mindfulness. The ability of sustaining the object of meditation is filled with all sorts of things going on. So we're easily distracted, we're easily tired, we find it effortful, it can be quite, we sort of notice that we're thinking all the time, the thoughts are rushing through. So these are good signs. What's actually happening is that we're now becoming more aware of the fact that this is the natural, a normal daily state of our mind. So in this sense, it's like, okay, well, it might feel like there's a lot happening when I'm sitting, but actually this is what's happening in my normal day-to-day routine. So by coming down and working on training our minds, we begin to see how untrained it is. And it's a bit like going to the gym for the first time and then realizing I didn't realize I was so unfit. So then we notice sort of how hard we find to do anything. So it's very much like that. So this sort of state of mind initially, what we have to work is very, very effortful. What we're having to do is to continually apply, remember what it is that we've chosen as our object, bring it back, and find ourselves distracted or forgetting what we're doing or falling asleep, and bringing that focus back according to the talks, according to the teachers, in terms of how to develop serenity. Then the next one is called continuous placement, and again this is really primarily where we are working on still continually putting it back. So there's a little bit less forgetful and a little bit more stable. We're able to sort of remember or recall the object of meditation throughout the session, throughout maybe a 15-minute, 20-minute session. We can keep the object of our meditation in front of us, or wherever it happens to be. If it's our mind, it doesn't have a place, but we're able to sustain it. It won't be clear, and it won't be reliable, and we will still be prone to distraction, but we're more focused on it, and in a sense there's more actually on than off. So this now is what it's called. That's why it's called continuous placement, because we're able to more or less, not continually all the time, keep the idea that we're meditating on our object. So we sustain the object of meditation, but it's filled with a lot of coarse distraction, sort of noise behind. So there's this, the beginning of the first training of mindfulness is where we're beginning to actually sustain our mindfulness quite well. Then patched placement is the third. At this point, it's like when we begin to, especially when we are distracted outside from, let's say, a stimulus or from a memory or whatever it is, then in that sense, patch placement is we are able to repair it and come back to focus very, very quickly. So this is where we're very gradually seeing more experience and greater skill and ability, facility, recognizing the tools that we have, recognizing the specific obstacles in serenity. So this is all based on experience. It's like nothing mysterious or strange or magical, but primarily all we're doing is we're, through practice, recognizing laxity, recognizing excitement, becoming a bit more vigilant, be a bit more aware of where we might be deviating, and we're still mainly working on our mindfulness. So it's still quite a work, it's sort of work. So this we fix it, where again we recognize distraction, both sorts of distraction, and we fix it, we apply it, it's patched. And then close placement. Whereas this is Kamalashila says, with close placement, while we previously recognized the distraction and then came back, in this one we've eliminated distraction, and we continue to actually sustain our attention on the object of meditation. This doesn't mean that we have no distraction whatsoever, but we're able to continually keep on task. So this is a very gradual change. We're looking at that, and at this point, where we're more or less exercised, we've become used to working with the mindfulness equipment, right, of keeping our mind on task. And what we're doing now is we're still developing the vigilance, and it's hard work for us. It's still not easy at all to do it, but we're sort of becoming much more used to it. It's not as hard work. It's not like we don't know what we're doing. It's not impossible for us. So at this point, it's like that. So in close placement, Ratna Kalashanti says, for instance, that our attention, which is by nature sort of tends to expand outwards at this time, we continue to bring it back in and refine it, establishing greater stability. So what these begin to look like is, initially when we're working on sustaining essentially an imagined object or the mind as an object, what we're trying to do is to keep it in focus or keep it bright and sharp. And first of all, we just have a blur, so what we're mindful of is the presence rather than necessarily the object at all. And then gradually we're able to sustain that presence, and then we're beginning to give it form. Then when we're working on that, what we see is if we are trying really hard, it's hard. We're over trying, and this means that we are unable to visualize easily. So if we're really, really tight, super tight, then the tightness itself prevents us from being able to see it clearly. So it's a bit like daydreaming. We don't really concentrate when we're daydreaming, but we can be all over the place in our daydreams without too much concern. So we can see, for instance, and also if somebody's telling us a narrative, it's quite easy for us to follow the narrative and enjoy the story and see and imagine things, especially if we have a very visual imagination. So with that, then, we can see that actually if we're applying effort in a way which is blocking it, then this is something we need to work on in terms of working out, developing within ourselves a rapport with our own minds to recognize how best to bring about that imagination. Once we've done that, then what we're doing is to sustain not a moving, not a narrative, to sustain the imagined object or the object of mind itself, the clarity of mind, which is sometimes very hard for people to even recognize at first, or the knowing nature of mind, which some people also find hard because the subject and the object are the same, or really the object is the prior moment of the current awareness. So in that sense, what we're looking at is we become more aware of what it is we're trying to do. At first, we need to really reconsider: have I got this right? Am I doing this correctly? Until we get it correctly, and then when we get it correctly, then we can start applying more thoroughly our mindfulness. And as we do that and our vigilance, then we can see this training. We can see our experience working out. If we break our practice, if we slow down, or if we're distracted by many other things, if we leave the preliminaries that we talked about several sessions ago, then we're going to find it, we're not going to see much progress. So we do need to be careful of sort of sustaining this practice and sustaining the preliminaries, keeping our minds in a good state. So although it doesn't say this here, one of the things is that one cannot really do any form of serenity training if one's taking drugs or drinking alcohol and so on, because essentially I think a small amount of caffeine's okay, but not too much. But basically, essentially, like tea or not too strong coffee. It's very hard to do it because these drugs have a very strong effect on our ability to deal with our mind at a very subtle level. So why we might have some success, in the end, what we're doing is we're creating too much difficulty for us. So also some medications, it's very, very hard to develop serenity with them. So in that sense, we need to be quite careful about knowing what our abilities are at the time, and not being distressed if we're unable to do it, but doing what we can to make sure that we can find that balance in the right time, and then we can apply it. So at this point, what we're seeing is that essentially this is at level 4, close placement, that because of the strength of our mindfulness, we're not distracted by external stimulus so much. We're able to just keep our focus. Taming, level 5. At this point, we sort of it's quite hard work to meditate. We might sort of find enjoyment in the fact that we've got any progress in terms of our mind training, but within taming, we begin to really take delight in it. We're in a position where we really recognize the benefits of what we're doing substantially, in a way where we look forward to our cushion. We look forward to our sessions. We look forward to training, continuing our training in Serenity, and we at that point we naturally work against anything that would obstruct us in our practice. And at this point, for instance, as for instance the Sravaka levels say that if we are distracted by sort of any of the 5 sensory objects, visual form or physical form or whatever, or for instance, or the poisons, attachment or hostility, or ignorance, or of a man or a woman or anything like this that is distracting to us, then as soon as these arise mentally, we see it as being an obstacle to our serenity. So we just put it to one side. It doesn't have so much an effect on us. We are beginning to see we have a sort of a realization that how these things are opponents or block our serenity, and by this point our serenity is what we're actually engaged in, and developing it, not training in it still. It's called taming. And then level 6, pacification. These are sort of very, very traditional titles for these different stages. So it's not like Rinpoche made them up. These are all very, very early Buddhist names. So at this point, any final sort of distraction, dislike or discomfort with the effort, is still effortful, not as much. We're still having to apply our work. We still need to work to it. But at this point, we see any distraction as a fault. All distractions as a fault, and we can concentrate on that. And at this point, we really have quelled all dislike for meditating. So at this point, what's different from taming, we'll go into that in a bit, but what's different from taming is that this is even sort of subtle mental factors are like, no. So it's a bit more, first of all, it's a bit coarse, and then it becomes more subtle in terms of our awareness of how it's distracting us in our practice. So then level 7 is complete pacification, and this is primarily to do with even things like lethargy, sleepiness, melancholy, and so on, are sort of at a fine level are removed. They're like, we don't engage them in them anymore. We'll work through them through using our mind training. So other teachers have said, for instance, that when we start doing, when we engage, especially in the middle levels of Shinit or Serenity training, a lot of our unconscious or low levels of consciousness come out. We have to deal with lots of things that it's a bit therapeutic. We have to deal with a lot of stuff that we have underneath, and they often come out, and this can cause a very strong degree of regret or melancholy that we need to overcome. But by we get to complete pacification, then we begin to recognize that this sort of regret or remorse is itself an obstacle. So there are all these sort of different stages of development, not just in terms of what's happening in the training, but also in terms of how this is expressed. So at this point, all the distractions and secondary afflictions that can affect us as a result of forgetfulness just don't appear anymore. And then at level 8 is what's called one-pointed attention. So at this point, we can engage. It's still effort. It still involves us effort to meditate. It's still work. We feel it, but so we choosing to engage in it. We engage in it very easily. We have a rapid, one-pointed, very clear, one-pointed or single-pointed attention, and then when we're engaging, it feels quite effortless. It's still actually not completely effortless, but it involves not much effort at all. So this is when we're talking about not over applying. So this is primarily learning now not to over apply, not to work too hard. So we're beginning to reduce to achieve equanimity. And one of the aspects of this is we are developing an increase in our enjoyment of meditation. So there's an increase in our enthusiasm for it at this point. We're feeling skilled. We've developed skill. And so another way in which another term used for the 8th is called single channel, because at this point we are able to sustain with effort a continuum of clear, bright, undistracted concentration for as long as we like. But it's effortful, so we're going to end up a bit tired maybe afterwards. And then there's what's known as balanced placement or equanimity, and at this point this is where we're able to sustain with a sense of effortlessness, so, the object of meditation. So when they talk about effortlessness, this isn't actually meaning that it doesn't expend any energy at all. What it means is that we do not need to work on our mindfulness or on our vigilance. It's natural to us. We're now achieved. We're very able to achieve this equanimity, this ability to work with our mind stably. So at this point, it's like saying, because of our work and because of our frequent practice, our familiarization and our dedication, it's then we reach this spontaneous and natural attention. And at this point, without having to apply the remedies, and with the spontaneity, our mind can enter into a flow of concentration without distraction. So there are 6 forces which we're using in this sense. These are the 9 stages, and then there are the 6 forces. This is mainly from Kamala Shila, who wrote this important text, Stages Meditation. And so the 6 forces that help us to develop our serenity start off with the force of hearing, the force of reflection, force of mindfulness, force of vigilance, force of enthusiasm, and the force of thorough acquaintance. Now, we have actually been through these previously, but we're now doing it within the set as a group. And so I'll just follow Rinpoche to repeat them in summary rather than in huge amounts of detail. The force of hearing is where we learn from having listened to or read instructions on how to develop serenity. We work on how correctly to apply mental placement, placing our mind. And he says at first we just simply fix our attention. We just do our best to fix our attention. But there's no familiarity and there's little experience. So then with the force of reflection, we accomplish the state of continual placement. This is this is as we have learned roughly how to do it, and then it's like, okay, well, what we need to do is, and these aren't like we do them one after another and just forget them. We need to continue to work on these things. So even when we're in stage 4, stage 5, then being able to refer back to texts on serenity, very, very useful for us. So, yeah, I mean, I think, okay, well, anyway, yeah. So force of reflection is we have the ability to continually place as a consequence of repeating and reflecting on the continuation of the fixation of attention on the object. So this is basically meaning that when we begin to achieve the ability to maintain a little continuity, we're using our own experience, our own understanding of, as well as with the hearing what we understand, to begin to recognize how this is going to work. So the force of mindfulness is where we begin to work on these. So in this sense, it's really doing according to the various different levels, the nine levels, but at the same time also, I think from what I remember Geshe saying, we also carry on doing these the whole time, not just thinking, oh, I don't need to do a reflection anymore, right? So, but Rinpoche is talking about it in the sense that suggests that they're linked more strongly with the 9 paths. So here then the fourth mindfulness is when we develop we accomplish patch placement because we're putting our mind back in, and a close placement. And with patch placement, this is I think level 3, and closed placement is level 4. Then in these cases, when our attention is distracted, we're mindful of the fact that what we're meant to be doing, and we'll be able to bring our mind back in again. And with closed placement, he says, is that our mindfulness is strong enough now for us to sustain the object from the beginning. So from this point, what we see is essentially from about level 4, in terms of the 9 levels, when we sit to meditate, we are able to bring the object of meditation up and sustain it from the get-go. So then with the force of vigilance, we're able to work on, this will help us with our taming and pacification, which is the levels 5 and 6. Now in fairness, vigilance again we need and mindfulness we need from the get-go. We need to develop these, but what he's talking about is that we will be using the vigilance in its final form for us to accomplish these later levels. And it's through vigilance we recognize the thoughts are being scattered and the signs of the secondaries. So that's how we're being able to recognize we need to bring it back, right? So mindfulness is remembering what we're doing and what we're meant to be doing and continually putting energy into what we're doing. And vigilance is watching into, looking, if you like, situational awareness without losing our mindfulness, sort of being aware of what's about to happen, what might happen, being able to adjust and tune our levels of energy required according to the mood, the precise mood or the precise context of the situation. So, for instance, it's a bit like saying, I think I said this before, a bit like if we're going to have to overtake a car or a lorry, we need to be put a little bit more energy in our driving. Driving was one of my sort of metaphors here. So when we're driving, we need to overtake. We increase the work, the attention, quite a lot. And then when we're there, we can decrease our attention a little bit. We still need to be careful and safety and aware, but so we need to adjust according to the situation. So it's like that. What we're doing is vigilance allows us to see that there's a truck coming, so we can prepare for that and do that without causing trouble in our continuity. So vigilance, enthusiasm is it's the enthusiasm that will get us to accomplish the mental states of pacification and of one-pointed 6 and 7, one-pointed attention. And it's through striving to eliminate even the subtle thoughts and secondary inflictions that we'll be able to overturn laxity and excitement and so on. So then acquaintance is the ability for us to achieve the last 2, 8 and 9 of one-pointed attention and balanced placement. And this is through primarily through having familiarity with our practice. So what we can see here is that developing serenity, it requires experience. It requires training. We can't expect ourselves to go on a weekend enlightenment course and have achieved serenity. If we are mentally equipped and we've done the preparation required and we have settled our affairs and we can find a place to train ourselves where we'll be free from distractions, and if we're mature in terms of our approach to what it is we're doing, we're very determined to do it, then we can achieve serenity in about a year. but it requires everything to be correct. And some of us have spent many years working on our serenity, and that's not wrong either. So we still need to train in this as well as we can. Even if we don't achieve very much, we'll notice a difference even in the early stages. So he says, if it's hard to understand what effortlessness means in terms of effortless at the 9th stage, he says, if you're familiar with reciting scriptures, for instance, then it's very easy to understand this. If you, I guess in many ways it's a bit like sort of reading aloud or something that we're very, very touch typing is a good example, or driving. So when we, when at first, sort of he's talking about reciting scriptures. So when we have the initial motivation to drive or to touch type or whatever, so we start off when we touch type, and we begin, and even if we're slightly distracted by something or whatever, so we see something or we hear something or whatever, the telephone rings or whatever, our ability to continue just continues effortlessly. We don't need to put much energy into it at all. We just carry on without interruption. So this sort of idea of saying, once we're familiar with touch typing, we can touch type, we can possibly deal with somebody asking us a question without breaking our typing. We can drive a car, we can have a light conversation, not too deep, while we're driving, and we're able to sustain the correct attention needed for driving. So likewise, this is what Rinpoche is talking about in terms of reciting scripture, is we can pick it up and you can recite your scripture, and it doesn't take any effort at all. So it's like this. It's sort of the same sort of idea like that. Bit grubby. So once our mind is once our mind's settled with mindfulness and we're fixed on the object meditation, even when even if we don't continually cultivate our mindfulness and vigilance, then our concentration is able to focus continually for a long period of time without being interrupted like that. And because there's no effort, we're not having to think about it all the time in terms of maintaining this stream of mindfulness and vigilance, then it's said to be without effort. So that's the point. Essentially, it's like it's not as if when we're driving or we're typing, we don't notice the energy. I mean, it doesn't mean there's no energy going on, but it feels like it's effortless in that sense. So, but how do we get there? Well, we need to put in the continual energetic cultivation of mindfulness and vigilance. So it's learning. It's sort of learning to train ourselves to the harness, if you like, learning to take that on, just like gyms. So when we're working on it, at first it's hard. We get more familiar with it. We get more familiar with it. We recognise it. And if we don't adopt if we don't apply the opponents to the particular issues, we will get stuck. So we need to ensure, we need to work on our mindfulness, we need to work on our vigilance, we need to be clear about the object of meditation and sustain the same object, not be distracted by another object, not be confused about the object. If the object of meditation is unclear to us, we need to increase its vividness, its clarity, and its brightness, especially if we're going dark, down, sort of running out of energy. Also, if we're physically tired or mentally stressed, then we'll find it easier for us to sort of begin to fall asleep, and the object of meditation will often transform or mutate or vanish. So these are early issues, right? Later on, there's not a problem for us. We're able to sustain our mind in a state of wakefulness. So it says, first of all, right, we need to, for us, in order to develop we're going to go backwards now, and I forgot. So what he's doing. So essentially, in order to have this effortlessness, in an earlier phase, we must have this continual energetic cultivation of mindfulness and vigilance. And in that phase, we need to develop a concentration which can be sustained through the meditation session without being disturbed by laxity or excitement. And that's the 8th mental stage. So there's effort involved, but it's not disturbed by any objects, any issues there. And he says the 8th and the 9th are similar in that they're not hindered by factors such as laxity or excitement at all. Or any other state which is incompatible with concentration. So, however, in the 8th state, we have to continually cultivate mindfulness and vigilance, right? So there is this effort involved. So it's associated with application. We're applying ourselves, whereas it's the non-application, which is the 9th. So in order to uninterruptedly cultivate the mindfulness and vigilance or effort, we must stop subtle laxity and subtle excitement, etc. So they occur. So when they occur, we're not governed by them. So for that, we need to have the 7th mental state. For the 7th to arise, right? We know where we're going here. We have to recognize that the distraction of thoughts and secondary afflictions is a disadvantage, and so we have to have an intense vigilance that monitors our attention, so that it doesn't, so that we stay on task, on focus. So for that purpose, we need the 5th and 6th mental states, and that because they are involved in establishing and strengthening our vigilance. And for our 5th and 6th mental states to arise, we have to have the mindfulness that keeps ourselves tied to the object of meditation, and prevents us from being distracted from it. And in order to have that, we need to have the 3rd and 4th mental states, because this is where we develop our mindfulness. And for this to arise, this experience of mindfulness, we must first of all have the ability to recognize and fix ourselves on the object of meditation, and to sustain a continual, undistracted continuity of the fixation. Yeah. So this is where the first 2 mental states arise. So he says, therefore, in terms of the path, in terms of the path of developing serenity, first of all, we need to follow understand what it is we're doing, recognize the different aspects of what we're doing. This isn't just made up by Rinpoche or by the Geluk or by Tibet or anything like this. This is very, very, very long traditional past in terms of how to develop serenity. It's pre-Buddhist, and Buddha himself was taught this. So this is something to consider. And once we understand how to do it, then we correctly apply the way in which to set our attention. And then as we develop a small amount of continuity, we try to work until we can sustain a continual stream of attention, right? And then if our mindfulness declines, we bring it back in again and become more mindful that we've forgotten, so we just bring it back stronger and stronger. And then as we develop strong mindfulness, we're able to keep the object from the outset. And then generally what we do is we use our vigilance to prevent these contrary states of mind from arising. And then as we do that, we become more aware of subtle distraction, subtle excitement. And so we can then apply our mindfulness for these subtle levels, and then that will show us our subtle, the subtle obstacles, so we can work on our vigilance for that, and so on. And at this point, we are able to develop the power of effort to lengthen the flow of our attention. This is attention which is persistent, continual, bright, and clear the whole time. Right. So what we're doing is this very, very subtle levels of concentration. And once this has arisen, we master our familiarity and accomplish the ninth mental state, in which our concentration becomes effortless, as we discussed earlier. So it says, until we actually attain this ninth state, we have to exert effort to apply our minds to concentration. But once we've achieved the ninth mental state, then whenever we choose, whatever we're thinking of, we're able to put our mind focus on it. However, pliancy, it is not guaranteed at this point. So pliancy is a particular state of mind and body with its own signs, and pliancy is not necessarily achieved when we achieve concentration. But this will be talked about later on. So Rinpoche is going to, we'll probably do this next session. So pliancy is, in terms of Buddhist terminology, this is when our mind migrates from the desire realm to the form realm, and essentially at that point there's a physical and mental pliancy, a sort of a freedom or flexibility that's very, very, very flexible. And at that point there are all sorts of very, very positive benefits to our meditations. Within non-Buddhist serenity trainees, they will then use this to move into the more and more refined form realm, and then into the formless realm and mental states. Very, very, very subtle. But for Buddhists, we're quite happy enough with achieving pliancy, the first of the four stages of the form realm. Because then we can use that for insight. So it says, so at this point it said, until we achieve serenity, pliancy, we haven't really achieved serenity. We're pretty close, and we'll be able to, as long as we continue to work on it, we'll be able to achieve serenity. But even at the ninth level, this is not yet serenity. So it says, if we haven't yet achieved serenity, then we certainly haven't achieved insight. Why does he say that? Because he says many, many people mistake the aspect of this freedom of this concentration, serenity, or near serenity mind as being enlightenment. Because they say that when we have a concentration which is adorned with this bliss, this clarity, and non-discursiveness, so there's no sort of thinking wordy, thinking this is this is that, so on. That goes in sort of stage 3 or 4. So we're really quite earlier on. We're not worried about that so much. It says we have this bliss and this clarity, this non-discursive awareness. That therefore we've brought about the non-discursive and sublime wisdom that integrates meditative equipoise and the post-equipoise state. This is a non-discursive sublime wisdom, right? And then he says lots of people are confused about this, and Buddhists and non-Buddhists both. But also, he says more than that, within the Tantras, a lot of people think that this is a culmination of the highest Yoga Tantra completion stage. So this state of mind is achieved through the highest Yoga Tantric stage. It's clearly not. So he says it's like a superpower. I mean, you have incredible power of concentration at this level, but it doesn't mean that you're enlightened. It doesn't mean that you've achieved a completion state yet. So next, Rinpoche wants to talk about the four attentions and how they're involved in the process of developing serenity. So they're called the four types of focus, if you like, or the four types of attention: tight focus, intermittent focus, uninterrupted focus, and spontaneous focus. And the first two of the 9 mental states are correlated with tight focus. So this is primarily where we're really having to work hard to achieve a clear and continual visualization aspect of the object of our meditation. So with this, primarily, we have to be. One of the obstacles is being overtight, but another obstacle, the primary obstacle, is our distraction, is our distracted mind. So again, and this is what Rinpoche said earlier on: don't concentrate too much on the tightness. Concentrate primarily on the mindfulness. So the mindfulness is our primary issue. Bring the mind back, and the clarity, the non-discursiveness, will happen of its own accord. So the same is that, so at first, most of us are going to be in the first or second level of this anyway. So at first, we're working on our mindfulness and our vigilance in terms of mainly mindfulness, and then we can gradually work on. When there's clarity, then that clarity will arise naturally. We don't need to worry too much about forcing a visualization. We're just doing the continual, right? So, these first is the tight focus, and then the next is the where we're able to withdraw ourselves from the world a bit in terms of our mind, in terms of our focus. Closed pacement, taming, pacification, complete. This is intermittent focus. So next, I think 5 states are intermittent focus, and this because every now and then, at first there's a deviation, distraction. But most of the time we're placed, and later on we are placed. But it can be a little bit weak at times. In the 8th step, where there's this single channel, we're able to sustain it with effort. This is called the uninterrupted focus. And then the 4th focus is where we have the 9th state, is known as the spontaneous focus. So the spontaneous focus is there. So Rinpoche is going to explain this a bit in terms of, he says, the first 2 mental states are strenuously tight. So this is tight focus. Then the next phase is 5. There's this interference by laxity and excitement. And we are unable to maintain long meditation sessions. So we can do, long is like more than 4 hours. So this is intermittent focus. Then the 8th mental state, we're easily able to sustain long meditation sessions. So 4 hours is no problem at all, without any interference of laxity or excitement. And this is uninterrupted focus. And then in the 9th, there's no interruption and no need for continual exertion. This is effortless focus, or or spontaneous focus. So he says in the first two mental states, there are occasions when our mind is and is not concentrated, with as we go through longer and longer periods of being concentrated. Whereas in the intermediate 5 states, the duration of concentration is much longer indeed. So interruption, we say, well, interruption of focus is primarily talking mainly about the first 2 states. Is the intermittent focus is primarily talked about in the latter 5 rather than the first 2, because even though there is some focus in the first 2, it's very, very small. So it's mainly about just having to hold it tight to get anything right there at all. So he says that while they're similar in terms of the presence of tight focus, they're dissimilar in terms of the presence and absence of interrupted focus. So the 5 are generally not talked about in that term. So he says, once we've established the preconditions for serenity training, and if we continue to work on it, and we are able to sustain our joyous perseverance and continue to train in it, we will achieve serenity. But he says, if we practice just a few times, or we don't have the preconditions, and then we sort of come back to it and leave it and come back to it, then it'd be very hard to accomplish serenity. And he says, actually, you won't. So he says we need to have this constant application, and then we can strive. He says if we slack off, this is from a Sangha, he says if we slack off in terms of our practice, it's like trying to slack off from creating fire from friction. So we, rubbing the wood. If we don't put the sustained effort in, we won't see the fire. We'll see just maybe a hole. So we have to, with a fire stick, right? We have to keep that energy going. We have to keep applying. Then we begin to see the smoke. Then we can use that smoke, blow on it, do it correctly, and then we can get fire. If we just do a few, bit of a stick. My arm's tired. I'll have a little rest. Okay, I'll try again. Anyway, how does it work? I'm so tired. We'll never ever see fire, right? We need to finish it. We need to get the job done. So this is exactly what's being said here. Do not stop striving until you reach a special state. So when there's a special state, primarily is when we actually get to about level 4, level 5, level 6, then it becomes much easier for us to continue our training. But then not to slack off, right? So essentially they're saying really what you want to do is to carry on until we achieve the form realm, also known as serenity itself, okay? So the next step is to look at the dividing line between accomplishing and not accomplishing serenity, and this is going to be precisely about pliancy. So looking at pliancy, and then also what to do with serenity, and specifically there's going to be a small amount on how to follow the mundane path rather than the Buddhist path, so the normal but that's going to be done later on. So nearly at the end though. So most of this is sort of quite a lot of detail in serenity and training in serenity, but it's not a huge amount. Mostly the most important thing is to practice it and to be clear about what it is we're doing and having a go. So I'm going to leave it for this session, And we'll do the remainder of this chapter in the next session, and then I think we've got a little bit more on serenity, and then we move into insight, which will be along many sessions, but very, very powerful, so very, very useful. Okay, so hopefully that's given us enough to work with for the moment, and something to consider. So let's think about using anything we've learnt today to set our minds to say, yeah, I can do this. I really can. We've got the ability to do this. I can work. If I can't work directly on the training, I can certainly work on the preliminaries, and I can start thinking about providing myself with the opportunity to start thinking about training correctly, training in serenity, and recognizing the advantages of this powerful mind, right? So really, really useful. Okay, so then let's finish off with a couple of minutes of sitting as ever.